Let's go over exercise 4.21, perfect numbers. To start, we need to know what a perfect number is. A perfect number is going to be any positive integer that is the sum of all of its factors, including one, but not itself. So for example, the number 6 would be the first perfect number because the factors of 6 are 1, 2, 3, and 6. And if we do 1 plus 2 plus 3, because we're not adding 6, then we're going to end up with 6. Okay, back to the actual problem. We're going to be writing a static method called perfect numbers that takes any integer as a parameter, then printing out all the perfect numbers that are less than or equal to that parameter. So let's start by creating that static method. Public static void perfect numbers. Now, instead of including a data type to classify what we're going to be returning, we're actually just going to write void. Since the program asked us to print the answer instead of returning it, void basically tells the computer not to expect anything when it runs this method. And obviously, we're just going to name our method perfect numbers. And then we're also going to include one integer parameter because that's what we're going to be given. And we're just going to name that max, just like that. Next, I'm going to create a string variable titled ANS, short for answer, because I'm going to eventually end up printing this. If we look at all the examples given to us, we can see that each one is printed in the same format. So let's write perfect numbers up to. As you can see, I have a break within my quotation marks where I just wrote max. This is because I don't actually know what my parameter is going to be, and it's going to change depending on what the computer decides to give us as our parameter. Now we're going to be using a nested for loop and 2 if statements to solve this problem. So in our first outer for loop, we're basically stopping at every single integer, starting from 6 to whatever our max is, so that we can check one by one if that number is going to be a perfect number. So for I is equal to 6, I is less than or equal to, because remember, we want to go up to and include the number max, I plus plus. Now, you might be wondering why we're starting at the number 6. We're just going to be starting at the number 6 instead of, say, like 1, since we know that the first perfect number is always going to be 6. All right, moving on. Inside this first for loop, I'm going to create an integer variable called num, which is just short for number, and I'm going to set that equal to 0. That'll be the first part of our inside. That'll be the first part of the inside of our outer for loop. Now that we have the number we want to check, that being I, we're going to want to start from 1 and go all the way up to I, and we're going to add all of the factors of I. And we're going to add it to our variable num. That's why we set num equal to 0 before the second for loop. When we add numbers, there isn't a value set to num to mess with our addition. So let's create that second for loop. Note here that I am saying int j is equal to 1, j is less than I, j plus plus, because at this point in the code, the computer has already assigned something to the variable I, so we have to use a different variable. And another thing, we want to set j equal to 1 instead of 0 here, and I'll show you why in just a sec. So to actually check if a number is a factor of another, we can just use the mod function, which is done with a percent sign. So mod basically returns the remainder of the division of two numbers. So if it returns 0, then we know that j goes into I evenly, and therefore j is going to be a factor of I. So let's do if I mod j is equal to 0. Just like that. And we're going to do num plus equal j. So if it turns out that j is a factor of I, then we're going to add it to num. So after the completion of this inner for loop, we should have the cumulative total of all the factors of j. Going back to the j equals 1 thing, this is just because when we are doing mod, we never want to have I divided by 0 and then finding the remainder of that, because then we're just going to get an arithmetic error. Anyways, moving on. Okay. So yeah, like I said, after the completion of that inner for loop, num should have the total of all the factors of j. Then we're just going to check to see if num is equal to I. Remember that I represents any number between 6 and that max number. It kind of just depends on where you are in that loop. And if they're equal, that's going to be a perfect number. So let's just check that using an if statement. If num is equal to I, So if num is equal to I, then we're going to just add that to our string. So and plus equal num, and then make sure you add a space. One thing to note, since we set num equal to 0 at the beginning of each loop right here, inside that outer for loop, num is going to reset every single time. So that's just going to make sure, like when we're adding it, it starts from 0 every single time. Okay, so now outside both of these for loops, at the very end, we should be printing out perfect numbers up to, and then the parameter followed by a list of all the perfect numbers. So we're going to say system.out.println. And we can just say ends here. And there you go. That's how you solve perfect numbers.